Hey, good morning, Mantas. You're doing two things today. You're doing the early Middle Ages and life on a manor. It's mostly reading, but then there's also some work you have to do. You have to put on your thinking cap. So let's get started. Early Middle Ages. The period known as the Middle Ages lasted from about 500 to 1500 AD or CE. It began as the Roman Empire was conquered by groups of people from an area from what is now known as Germany. By the mid 500s, five of these groups controlled most of Europe. We covered these the other day here. The Visigoths, who had conquered Rome and held most of the Iberian Peninsula, which is now Spain. The Vandals controlled North Africa and the large Mediterranean islands. The Ostrogoths had taken over most of Italy and the Western Balkans. The Saxons had conquered the southern part of what is now England, and the Franks had controlled most of Gaul, which is now France and Western Germany. They did not govern these large areas as single countries. Each tribe had many leaders called chieftains. Each chieftain ruled only as much land as his warriors could defend. The Germanic tribes spread fear and destruction at first. Gradually, however, they learned the ways of their more civilized neighbors. Chieftains often imitated Roman forms of government. Charlemagne, the man who came closest to recreating the Roman Empire, was during the man who came closest to recreating the Roman Empire during the early Middle Ages looked like he was born to be a king. In a time when most warriors were a little over 5 feet tall, he was 6 feet 4 inches with broad shoulders and straight posture, and he seemed to show a king's strong will. The king's name was Charlemagne, which meant Charles the Great. In 768 AD, he became king of the Franks, the tribe that gave France its name. Later, Charlemagne conquered large parts of Germany and Italy. Charlemagne had close ties with the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. Charlemagne had helped Pope defend Rome. In 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as the head of the lands, later called the Holy Roman Empire, and gave him the title of Augustus. In Charlemagne's time, very few people could read and write. Most of those who could were priests or scholars who worked for kings or nobles. Charlemagne respected learning. He encouraged scholars from all over Europe to come to his court. He set up schools for his nobles and their sons. He urged priests throughout his empire to teach all those who, with God's help, are able to learn. Charlemagne had a strong desire to rule fairly. He dictated many letters to his nobles, giving instructions about government, law, religion, education, and trade. He sent royal messages to find out how well his government was working. Charlemagne also traveled around his lands to make sure his people were treated justly. Once or twice a year, Charlemagne met with his major officials. Spring meetings called the Fields of May became famous. They were festivals for Charlemagne's followers. In a pasture filled with flowers, Charlemagne set up a small city of tents and consulted with his officials. In his concern for strong, wise government, Charlemagne was like Augustus, the Emperor of Rome. Charlemagne's peaceful rule was the high point of the early Middle Ages. The Vikings. Before Charlemagne's death in 814 AD, fierce warriors called Vikings threatened the security of his empire. The Vikings came from the north, from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. At first, the Vikings were interested mostly in plunder or goods taken by force. They sailed along the coast and far up European rivers in their dragon-headed ships. Wearing leather helmets, the Vikings carried double-edged swords and round shields. These sailors were so tough that they slept on the open decks of their ships, even in the freezing storms of the North Sea. When the Vikings arrived at a town, they usually attacked its church first. They took religious objects made of gold and silver. Then they raided the homes of the townspeople and farms. By the middle of the 10th century, raids became fewer as the Vikings developed some other interests. Some Vikings became traders, sailing as far as Constantinople and what is today Russia. They contributed knowledge of trade routes and sailing to the people they met. Some Vikings were explorers. They made their journey to North America about 500 years before Christopher Columbus did. Other Vikings became colonists, setting up farms and towns in countries that they had attacked. Many of these colonists became Christians. The Vikings, like the Germanic tribes before them, became part of Europe's settled communities. The Vikings both enriched and were absorbed by the lands they raided. So we need you to write one of the bold underlined words from the reading next to its synonym or definition. I'll give you this example. First one is copying. Now, of all the words that are underlined and bolded, I think recreating, copying, recreating, kind of the same thing. I think you get the general idea. Is how that works. Life on a manor. This is the second document you're working on. Life in the Middle Ages centered around the manor, or large estate. A feudal lord. The wealthier lords lived in large castles, but most lived in manor houses. The size of a lord's manor house depended on his wealth. Clustered around or near the castle or the manor house were the huts and shops of the serfs and freemen who worked for the lord. Together with a chapel and a mill, these structures made up a small village. Beyond the village were the lord's fields, pastures, lands, on which for hunting. Most manors in the Middle Ages were laid out in this fashion. While the lord and his family in their castle or manor house enjoyed all the comforts associated with their position, the peasants and his family struggled just to survive. There were two types of peasants: freedmen and serfs. Freedmen had higher status because they were not bound to anyone, but their lives were nearly as hard as serfs' lives. With bandits and invaders roaming the countryside, looting and killing at will, peasants had no way of defending themselves. Thus, many entered into contracts with powerful lords. In return for the right to seek safety inside the walls of the lord's castle or manor house in times of trouble, many peasants agreed that they and their descendants would become serfs and work the fields of their protectors. They also agreed to give their lord a certain percentage of the crops they grew as some of their livestock they raised. But serfs were not slaves. They had certain rights that slaves never enjoyed. One was the right to strips of land, which they met their needs for food, clothing, and shelter. After meeting their own needs and the amount due to the lord, they would sell the rest. Another was a guarantee that they could not be sold separately from the land they were bound to. Serfs were as much a part of a lord's land as were all the buildings and materials and fields. If a lord sold his estate to another lord, the serfs quite naturally went along as part of the deal. Farmers used the three-field method of farming. One field was planted in autumn, usually in wheat or rye. A second field was planted in spring, this time either in barley for making beer, water was often unfit to drink, or in beans, peas, and oats. A third field was left fallow or unplanted to preserve the fertility of the soil. Each year a different field was left fallow. The strips of land were spread throughout these three fields. Some serfs owned only a small amount of land, but others possessed as much as 30 acres. Serfs were usually free to work their own field 3 days a week. The rest of the week, except for Sunday, was given over to the lord's land. On his own strips, the serf could grow fresh vegetables or grains, but he was required to give a portion of his harvest to his lord. The lord also received a portion of the serf's chickens, pigs, and livestock. The serf's duties extended beyond the lord's fields. He might have to run errands for his lord's lady and had to have his grain ground in the lord's mill for a fee. The same held true for the lord's oven for baking and his wine press for turning grapes into wine. The serfs had to cut his own firewood and hay on the lord's land and give a portion of his to the lord. In times of extra work, such as building, planting, or harvesting, the serf could be called on to haul, stone, plow, sow, and harvest. The serf's agreement with his lord also required him to give him extra on feast days. For example, at Christmas, he might have to give one of his best fowl, and on Easter to come forward with the sheep. Serfs hardly ever had a minute to rest. Even so, Sundays, feast days, and perhaps a week at Easter and Christmas were holidays. On these days, he gathered with fellow serfs and their families for sports and other activities. Serfs' wives and daughters also worked hard. When not laboring in the fields alongside the men, they helped out in the manor house. They spun cloth and made clothing. They baked bread and brewed beer. These tasks were in addition to those they were expected to perform in their own huts. At the end of the serf's long workday, he retired to his humble hut. The typical hut was built of wood It had 1 or 2 rooms and a dirt floor and a thatched roof. If it had windows at all, they were only slits covered with oiled cloths. In the center was a hearth for cooking and heat. There was no chimney. Smoke went out a hole in the roof. More than one hut went up in flames because of this arrangement, because the thatched roofs of the huts were easily set on fire. Cooking was often done outside when the weather was good. Serfs produced their own food, which was just as plain as the quarters in which they lived. They ate a diet of black bread and vegetables such as cabbage, carrots, and onions. They also had dairy products and some pork. Water was usually unsafe to drink, so they drank mostly beer. They had no sugar, no potatoes, no tea, and no coffee. They did have salt, but only in limited amounts. They seldom ate meat. Contrary to what some people might believe, the short life expectancy of the average serf, about 30 years, probably had little to do with diet. Black bread is chock full of vitamins and nutrients, and no one ever died early from eating cabbage and garden vegetables. And from what we know about their nutrition and health, serfs were better off not eating a lot of meat. Their short lives were probably due to hard work and the total absence of hygiene and sanitation, which caused diseases that took the lives of many of the manor serf and lords alike. Men of all ranks wore tunics, with the length of the tunic and the brightness of its colors signifying rank. Serfs wore a short woolen tunic and trousers that were held together by leggings and thin leather. The tunic had sleeves and slipped over their head like a sweatshirt. The serfs also wore either a belt or a piece of rope that kept the tunic in place around the waist. He completed his attire with leather boots. In winter, he added an animal skin cloak and woolen gloves and hat. The serf's wife dressed similarly, but a skirt in place of the trousers. Daughters dressed like their mothers, and sons dressed like their fathers. Many years would pass before the clothing of children ceased to be smaller versions of those of their parents. Occasionally, a serf who could no longer endure conditions on the manor would run away. To do so was chancy at best. In the early parts of the feudal era, when few small towns existed, there was really no place to run. In addition, life outside the manor was dangerous, and a runaway serf ran the risk of being killed. There was also the certainty that if he was captured and returned to his lord, he would be subjected to the cruelest of punishments. When more towns began to appear in the 13th century, rulers declared that any serf who ran away and hid for a year and a day was said to be a free person. Many serfs gained their independence in this manner. Others became free when their lords were killed on crusades to the Holy Land. And even more were able to buy their freedom when the Black Death, a terrible disease that raged through Europe, killed 1/3 of the continent's population. With the labor force so reduced, serfs were able to bargain for their freedom for at least for more rights in return for working the land. Now, from that, synonyms, word from the reading, fill in the blanks, go get them.